More than 70 years have passed since the Allies liberated the Nazi concentration camps in Eastern Europe, but the horrors that unfolded there remain as unimaginable as ever. But novelist Affinity Konar takes on the terrible task in her new book, Mischling. It is set against the brutality of Nazi physician Josef Mengele's eugenics experiments. Affinity Konar joins us now here in our studio. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm not going to pretend that this is a unique or original first question, but it seems to be, in much of what I've read about your writing, something that a lot of people are interested in. And that is, do you have a personal connection to the Holocaust that inspired you to write this book?
Well, it's a connection that is not direct, but it was very present throughout my whole life. My family on my father's side left Poland in 1932. They started trickling over in 1917, and by 1932, everyone was safely harbored in Utica, New York. So I grew up with a sort of awareness about Poland and what had become of it, and I always felt compelled to look at the history that had happened. It was something that just colored my childhood in a very unique way. But that was my kind of personal connection.
Why did it color your childhood?
I think I was a child who sought out stories. I was always, and that might have been something that came from my parents. I was constantly surrounded by narrative. And to me, this was one of the most compelling stories that a person could find. And it sort of informed my whole notions of the world as a very young child. How cruel people could be, and also how people could save others. I was just transfixed by all of the complications, all the sort of human connections that could be drawn from it.
Mm-hmm. Jewish background at all?
I didn't grow up in a traditional Jewish home, but I do have ancestry, so there's that connection. And I was just always struck by this history in a way that I could never really explain. It felt like something that I had been born with.
Let's, before we get into the story itself, let's hit on the head one of the big issues that I think you've had to deal with as you've made your travels on this book, and that is that there are obviously people who believe that it is anything from inappropriate to sinful to fictionalize anything having to do with the Holocaust. It was just too awful and ought only to be done, the argument goes, in nonfiction form. Do you have to take special care as a result, special care, when trying to fictionalize something related to the Holocaust?
I think the utmost care, and that sort of responsibility was not something that I ever imagined myself capable of bearing. The sort of burdens that come with approaching this history, it stalled me for years. In many ways, this was the book that I did not want to write. And at the same time, it was the only one that I could write. I would try to write other books, and I would find that they were sort of imbued with an interest that was really best captured by this story of the twins. And it started to feel like a part of my writing life was being denied in a way that I needed personally. And so I started writing the book for myself and for my family. And I thought that it could be useful in this very small setting. I did not imagine it traveling out. And so when the prospect of it leaving this very tiny protective realm appeared, all the questions became even larger. And I had to revisit the book with a certain attention to question myself, my motives, to question the portrayal of everything that I was doing. It became, in many ways, more of a process of questioning than it was writing.
So when you asked those questions of yourself, did you like the answers you came up with?
Not always. And it made me sort of recalibrate the book repeatedly, because I wanted to recognize the sort of boundaries of my own pain, to recognize that I could never fully understand the trauma that these children experienced. And so I had to make a very concerted effort to make them distinct personalities that functioned as tributes to the people that inspired them, and to not permit any bit of myself to leak into them. That was very important to me.
Do I have the chronology of this right? You have been to Auschwitz, the death camp in southern Poland that the Germans set up during World War II, more than 1 million people killed there, but not, in terms of timing, you hadn't been there before writing the book. Is that right?
I had not. And that was one of the things that made me wonder if the book was ever going to, people ask me now, you must have imagined that people would want this book. And no, I was quite sure that they would not, because it was very difficult. I was never able to get a grant the few times that I tried. And so yes, I only very recently went to Poland after the book had been completed, and that was a very daunting experience.
Before I ask you about the trip, have you run into people who find it problematic that you would write such a book without having first been there?
I have had that question come up, yes.
And?
And I do think that ultimately it is the people that matter in this book and not the place, that the place begins to recede. The place needs to be there, it needs to be recognized, it needs to be factually accurate. I'm not trying to diminish the place in any way, but it is the people that need to be given illumination.
So having written the book and then visited, what was it like finally to be there?
It was an experience that I'm still spooling through in my mind. I am 38 years old, and I spent that night in the same bed with my mother. It was an utterly terrifying experience. And I think the fact that I went with my family, I went with my parents, affected me deeply. Because I don't think you can tread on that ground without sort of feeling the reverberations of so many goodbyes. And in many cases, these weren't goodbyes at all. The sort of violence strikes you in a different way. And I think that traveling around the grounds and also just seeing the sort of surrounding beauty was very problematic to me. I would see fellow travelers who had come to visit picnicking on the lawn and beneath these beautiful, beautiful willows. And, that Nazis used to picnic in those same spaces, that this used to be a place where some people were permitted a leisure.
Tell me as well, Affinity, when were you there?
I was there in early August.
Early August. Okay, so some months ago, I've only known you for 10 minutes, so you're going to forgive this observation. It's a bit imprudent of me to make it. It still seems very fresh for you. Yes?
Yes. It's difficult. I think part of why I was so drawn to this history is because it is about the unspeakable. And so I was constantly trying to look at how it might be articulated on the page. And now I'm finding myself struggling to articulate this experience of visiting the camp. And it feels like a very fresh thing that I keep revisiting. And I don't know if I'm ever going to feel that I've reached a sort of end point.
This is Holocaust Education Week, so I think what we should do here is not assume that people watching this right now know all about this awful chapter of history. So we're going to do a little basic history here, starting with, who was Josef Mengele?
Josef Mengele was a doctor who found his way to Auschwitz, and he enjoyed a position there that he probably would not have enjoyed anywhere else, where he was given free rein to experiment on children and anyone who captured his sort of genetic interest.
And what happened to the children that he experimented on?
The children lived in barracks that were called the zoo. And these children endured experiments that many of them are so terrifying to describe. These experiments were intended supposedly to help Mengele arrive at some sort of way to engineer a master race and repopulate. He was interested in certain features, obviously. He was interested in perpetuating blondness, light eyes. So children who bore these features were of particular interest to him.
As your book describes, he had a particular fascination with twins. How come?
Yes, twins were an ideal find for him because they presented an opportunity for experimentation where he could use one as an experimental subject and use the other as a control subject.
It's been 70 years, more than 70 years, since Auschwitz was liberated, and yet I think it's fair to say we still don't know as much about it as we probably ought to. Why is that?
I think it's so hard to look at. I think this particular chapter is even harder maybe to look at because it involves children. I think that education perhaps has dropped the ball in many places, and it's become sort of the burden of families in many cases to educate their children about what has happened.
What happened to Mengele?
Mengele, what happened to him was in many ways what drove this book, because I found myself completely maddened over the years by the fact that he was never apprehended for these crimes. He was never made to account for anything that he did, and that, in fact, he lived a quite peaceable life in Brazil, where he spent his days writing his memoirs and communicating with his family, and feeling actually that he was quite put off in life, that he was experiencing his own kind of tribulation and persecution simply because he was unable to return to a life in Germany.
And how did he die?
He had a heart attack while he was swimming in the sea.
So, I mean, that's just some outrageous injustice there,
Yes.
isn't it? Yeah. The title of the book is Mischling. What does that mean?
It's a Nazi term. It means mixed blood, and it was used to classify Jews of mixed heritage. And if you were Mischling, it was an advantage within the camps in a certain way, and it was also a huge kind of, there was a burden of guilt that attended that too, because you were automatically treated in a better way that perhaps enabled your survival because you were of an interest to Mengele.
Here's an excerpt from your book. Everyone survived by planning. I could see that. I realized that Stasha and I would have to divide the responsibilities of living between us. Such divisions had always come naturally to us, and so there, in the early morning dark, we divvied up the necessities. Stasha would take the funny, the future, the bad. I would take the sad, the past, the good. This story you tell is obviously the story of twins, and based on real-life twins, eh? Can you tell us about Pearl and Stasha Zamorsky?
Pearl and Stasha, they were the reason why this book was bearable to write. Those personalities and their bond made the book worthwhile for me, and I almost felt, in a strange way, sheltered by the sort of love and affection that they had for each other. It was very odd, a sort of living thing. And the book was inspired by Stasha first, and it came from a sort of statement that was made by a boy. He was named Peter, and he was 11 years old when he was in Auschwitz. And I should preface this by saying that all the children within the zoo were given these dull little pocket knives that they could use to cut their bread. And the Nazis thought nothing of this because what is it to give a child this dull pocket knife? But Peter said that he kept sharpening his pocket knife on anything he could find because he swore that when the time came and the end, he was faced with an end, that he was going to take at least one Nazi with him. And it was this sort of spirit, this very rebellious spirit crossed with his innocence that inspired the character of Stasha. And I could never stop thinking about that statement. And then in time, as I was working through her voice, I also saw that the book had a need to bear witness in a very precise way. Stasha's voice is a very emotive howl. It's very raw. She's in some ways an unreliable narrator. So the book very much needed Pearl to step in and sort of relay events in a more clear way, in a clearer way that could inform the reader of what exactly these children were experiencing. And that was, in many ways, it was the more challenging voice to write, even though it might seem a little plainer on the page. That burden to bear witness was so difficult. And I found that Pearl was also inspired by, there's a set of twins, Eva and Miriam Moses. And Pearl has this message of forgiveness, and that's directly inspired by Eva Kor. And that's how she's chosen to deal with this history. And I can't imagine it for myself, this forgiveness. I often feel guilty that I have it written into the book. How she has managed it, I cannot comprehend for myself. But this is her message, and she's committed herself and her entire life to preserving the history of the twins. There's a museum in Indiana that she runs, and she also has an organization called Candles. And her sister, Miriam, she's passed, but Eva is still with us.
I'm going to invite you to have a swig of water if you like, because I'm going to put you to work here. I would like you, where the bookmark is, to open your book and read the passage that we have outlined, and then we'll discuss some of that. Here's Affinity Konar reading from her novel, Mischling.
All those innocents, I didn't wonder about their futures that day as I left the abandoned house. I couldn't know their destinations, their triumphs, their troubles. The ones who integrated themselves into new cities and forgot themselves in new professions, either forming empires grand enough to blot out a past, or failing to thrive because they couldn't get the sound of their own blood out of their heads. The ones who married other survivors, and the ones who wouldn't marry because they had nothing to offer a marriage bed but night terrors. The ones who took comfort and freedom in the soil of the kibbutz, and the ones who found themselves lying on a different set of tables, granting permission to other doctors to burn the branded memories from their brains, to take away, once and for all, the misery that he had imprinted upon us. They were children once.
What are you trying to get at there?
I think that the story of the twins is so difficult because it's also the story of an interrupted childhood, a childhood that's not just interrupted by war, but by a cruelty that is unimaginable. And there's a question of how one sort of returns to life after enduring that sort of suffering, after being halted in that way, having your development entirely stunted by a man who chose to swoop in and tamper with these children for his own aims. And I think, there's such an array of ways that survivors have dealt with this past, this very painful territory. And I think it's important to sort of recognize the kind of randomness of survival and the fact that there is no guarantee. The book speaks about hope a lot, but hope doesn't always make itself so available. And, this line about lying on other beds, seeing other doctors, the burden of returning to a life after being so imprinted with this kind of suffering, this pain, it's a whole new, different life to work through, I would imagine.
I want to finish up on this because I think if you've been to Auschwitz or if you've written about Auschwitz, and you and I have done both, at some point you ask yourself, had I been there at the time, how would I have fared? Would I have survived? Would I have killed myself because I couldn't stand the the evil, how would I have done? Have you asked yourself that question?
I think it's interesting that you would say that, because that was many times my sort of entry into it as a child. That was the sort of question that I wanted to know. It was a question that I was putting up against my own character. I wanted to know how I would react. I wanted to know, would I be of aid to someone? Would I turn my back on somebody? Reading Primo Levi when I was a child, that was a sort of, confrontation with my own kind of morality, my own sort of relationship with other human beings. There's always that question of how you would act. And yes, visiting that place puts it up into a sort of cloud that, I don't know, it drifts above your head and you never really are able to grapple with it.
Did you come up with an answer? I know I never did.
No, I know I would like to. I know the answers I would love to assign to myself.
Yes. Yeah.
And I know what I would hope for myself, but I have to recognize that this is something I can never understand.
Yeah. I'm so glad you visited us here at TVO today. The book is called Mischling, Affinity Konar, Safe Back to Los Angeles when you eventually leave our province of Ontario, and it's so good to meet you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.